Tonight's conversation, I think is going to be, first of all, I think is very needed. For the last 15 years of this movement, I don't think the church has had a cohesive, good understanding and response to be able to speak truth and speak love into a culture that definitely needs it. And you're going to be enlightened with what you learn tonight. It's really going to be good. I'm excited tonight because I've known Garry for several years, and his story is very unique. And the fact that what he and his wife now do through their ministry is just so powerful. It's just really good. So I'm thankful to have Garry on here with me. Garry, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Eric. Great to be with you.
Well, man, thank you so much for being with me. I appreciate it. I'm passionate about what you guys do. And when I first met you guys here in Pensacola, you and your wife shared your entire story with me, and I want you to share some of that tonight, of how you are actually a former homosexual. Your wife lived as a lesbian in that whole, I don't know what you want to call it, that whole arena, that whole field. And God miraculously has worked in your hearts and lives. You guys are married, have children, and a ministry to help churches and help people right where they're at, and you don't compromise on the truth, and you package it with a lot of love. Garry, thank you for doing what you do, buddy.
Yeah, so absolutely. We're glad to do it and feel like, honestly, this is the moment that we're living in, I feel like is a great deal of what I was created for.
Wow, and that well put. For those of you that are joining us live, there's a chat feature, and if you have any questions for Garry, I want you to feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll bring those to his attention. There's also a Q&A feature, so if you want to ask a question anonymously, you can actually ask a question and stay anonymous. And that might, if you want to do that, and you can ask even real personal questions, and we won't know who it is, and nobody on the webinar tonight will know who it is. So feel free to take advantage of that and ask serious questions, because I know this is a serious subject, and it's incredibly personal. Garry, as we begin this conversation talking about something, it's talking about our sexuality, which really is I would say holy, but a very personal thing. Is there anything you think would be wise to kind of let the audience, any other caveats that I may not be aware of that we should address for the audience of why we're going to take so much, you take so much care in discussing this topic?
Well, the only thing that really occurs to me just to mention about that, Eric, is just that, and I think you kind of alluded to it anyway, but the church is, we love the church. I love the church. I was a pastor for 12 years, worked on a pastoral team for 12 years, and now lead this ministry. And so our ministry is about supporting the church. It's not about, kind of drawing people away into sort of what we're doing. Our ministry is all about really sowing into the lives of pastors and Christian leaders and building up the church. But to say that, or along with that, we recognize that when it comes to the topic of sexuality, sex in general, and even identity, the church has not had good answers in most cases. And simply having a just don't do it message is completely ineffective for people who are wrestling with their sexuality, with gender questions, and for the majority of people not necessarily dealing with gender identity issues, but just how do I steward this amazing gift that God has given me? But sometimes it doesn't feel so amazing. Sometimes we just wish, frankly, we didn't have it and didn't have to deal with it. But God has a good design, and God has a big vision for our lives. And I think the more the church can speak into that big vision and cast that and really invite people into being known and into walking together toward Jesus in the light. That means our junk is in the light with at least some others. That's really where we believe the solution lies and where real healing lies.
Tell me this, because again, you're not speaking from somebody who's got academic experience. You've lived this. How big of a hurdle is this? I mean, if I asked you the question, I don't want to go there. I'll let you get there. Can you be gay and a Christian and all that? But start with, okay, how big of a hurdle is this? I mean, are we asking people, well, just you go, because I don't want to kind of project on it. I just want to, how big is this for people?
Well, so when you ask that question, the first thing that occurs to me is really to say it's the hardest issue I've ever dealt with in my life. The idea of wrestling with, for as long as I can really remember, wrestling with same-sex attraction, early exposure at 5 or 6 years old to hardcore porn by some older neighborhood boys, as well as some of their sexual behavior together. That had a huge impact on my life, and really from then forward, and certainly by puberty. I was realizing that, wow, I'm attracted to boys. I think a similar way that I'm hearing other boys talk about girls, and I was horrified by that. I didn't want that to be a part of my reality, but I had no place to go to with it. And so to wrestle with that for so many years, to deal with it in isolation and secrecy, full of shame, and for the church to be so unprepared and so ill-equipped to help someone like me who wanted help and support, and then to feel like God was doing nothing in all the years that I spent praying and asking for him to take away these desires. I knew what his word said. It's abundantly clear, regardless of what revisionists want to do around the topics of homosexuality with the Bible. To me, it was abundantly clear. It always had been abundantly clear. And then to go, to abandon really my family in many ways, and my former faith, and just to say, eventually I left Bible college and just said, God, I quit, and got kicked out finally when I went back because they were concerned that I might be suicidal. But I left there just feeling like, really, God, I hate you and I hate your church. I'm so sick of wrestling with this and having no answers. And so when I eventually came to the place of recognizing, well, this isn't taking me where I want to go. There's no real life in this. This is just a revolving door of relationships, one night stands and all this stuff that I was really addictively doing, but hated what I was doing. My original goal was to find, Mr. Right and settle down for the rest of my life. And that ship sailed very quickly after I came out to my first bar. But I say all that to say that when it finally came to a point of feeling like, okay, this is not where I want to go, but where do I want to go? Because to go back to the church, for me, in my experience, felt like I was going back to a place that had no answers. There was no real, there wasn't much relationship there either in many respects, not for someone like me. And so it was a very difficult and hard journey to deal with something, and to begin to unpack what felt like identity, what felt like was hardwired, and what I believed at one point that was the case. But as I pursued Jesus, as he, began really revealing himself to me, that he wasn't the God that I grew up believing in as being this slave master that demands we love him, that he was so much more than that, not that at all, actually. I began to want more and more of to embrace a true identity, which is rooted in the fact that I'm an image bearer as a man made in the image of God, that women are image bearers made in the image of God, of equal value, but of distinct expressions of the image of God. And I wanted to begin learning, what does it mean to be a man made in the image of God, and how do I fully live this out? And one of the things I don't want to forget to say, Eric, is that what I've realized over the course of my time pastoring at a large church in upstate New York, on pastoral staff, I wasn't a lead pastor, but in that time, as well as the time that I've been in ministry, what I've realized is just because men and women may be opposite sex attracted, that in and of itself does not mean they have a clue of what it means to be a man or a woman made in God's image. And so in that sense, frankly, we're all confused. And in that sense, we all are in desperate need of help. And so in a similar way, when Jesus refers to prostitutes and sinners getting into heaven ahead of the Pharisees, I think that there's ways that we in the church, people who have never dealt with these issues, need to recognize that just because they haven't dealt with same-sex attraction, or maybe sexual addiction or porn addiction or whatever in the heterosexual realm, in some ways that desperation, that addictive, the addictive reality of that, in our desperation, I think there are ways that we are closer to discovering who God really is than those who have just kind of made lots of assumptions about him and haven't really wrestled or surrendered these tougher areas of their lives.
That's a challenging thought to everybody, to every single one of us. How well have we wrestled with who we are and who God is? And that's interesting, because a lot of times I know growing up, and my wife and I have this defining moment of a pastor at our house sitting on the couch asking my kids, what do you think about a homosexual, and my kid's going, ew, and him going, you see, that's the problem. You're not really seeing them as an image bearer of Christ that needs the love of Christ. And for us, that was a defining moment where we just went, we are the wrong reaction. We are the church doing the wrong reaction. And I can't say that I don't know if I'd done that in front of my kids. I don't remember doing that, but that's certainly anyway what they got. So we kind of failed there. Well, I want you to I want you, if it's okay, just kind of lead us in this discussion. And for those of you watching, if you have questions, I'm going to try to keep an eye over here. Marlissa's in the chat. She'll be putting some links in there for us as we go along. There's going to be some really good, helpful websites that Garry will talk about along the way. But Garry, if you just lead us, take us from kind of continue your testimony, and then just take us through what do we as the church, as the body of Christ need to know, and if there's somebody on here that's struggling with, what do they need to know? So let you kind of lead, and I might jump in and ask questions every once in a while. If that's
no, please do. I will just kind of pick up a little bit with my own story. So when I finally came out in front of my first gay bar at the age of 19 years old, it felt like I'd finally found my people. I mean, it felt like I finally fit in somewhere. I didn't fit in the church. I didn't fit in my family. So it was very euphoric to begin with for a number of months. And then I actually wound up not at this particular bar, but when I moved to another place, I of course found the sort of local gay bar there, or bars, and I began bartending at one of the gay clubs. And so I really did embrace that identity fully. And now at the same time, I knew that I had a praying mother and a praying father, but especially I had a praying mother who was not letting go of God when it came to him getting in and messing around in my life. And so I am very, very thankful today for the fact that that really she just continued to pray and didn't give in to my desires. Right, I wanted my mom and dad to come around to accepting my boyfriend. You know, one guy at one time and another guy later on. I wanted them to come around to accepting that this is who I am, and beginning to sort of make peace with that. And while they never shamed me, they didn't kick me out of their house. They didn't do any of those crazy things that I've had some friends where that's happened to. They didn't do that kind of thing, but they really loved me well in that they were gracious and kind, but they were laboring really under a lot of agony on behalf of their son. And so I always knew that that there was a friction there. And honestly, I hated the friction at the time, but as I look back on that, it was one of the things that drew me back to the Lord. It was one of the things where I knew there would always be something about our relationship that would be off, not because they left me, because frankly, I left them. I left the path that I was on. So,
and you knew that inside that whole time. You knew that this wasn't them reject. This was you walking away.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, I also, it's true that I did know that, but my emotional state was very, very immature. I'd never really healed from a lot of the wounds that I'd received growing up, not just the sexual, some of the sexual abuse and the early exposure to pornography, but also the bullying in school. I was always a source of bullying in school, at church. Some of that was physical. A lot of it was just name calling. And so I just had this miserable, I don't remember ever really being happy as a kid growing up. It just seemed like I was always under the weight of something and felt pretty tough. So, but looking back, I didn't have the maturity to recognize all that I'm kind of saying right now necessarily. And, but frankly, you know what, what I've learned is I've worked with as a pastoral counselor and as a pastor, I've worked with lots of people who are dealing with all kinds of issues who, frankly, most of us are stunted in our emotional growth. So it isn't just in this area, it's across the board. But from that point on, I really came to know the Lord at a crisis point, well, on the interstate in New Jersey. I had been, this was several years later after my bartending days, and I I had an experience where I was just listening to some Christian music, which is odd because I was also angry at God. So I'm not sure why that happened, but I was listening to some Christian music and there was this lyric that came on. It was a new song that I hadn't heard before. And something in the lyric, I don't even remember what it was now, but I had been so hard-hearted and the emotions were just packed down and packed down and packed down. And, when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6:18, flee sexual immorality, like he's being a really good father as he's writing this letter to people he loves and says, flee sexual immorality. Every other sin that a man or woman commits is outside the body, but the one who sins sexually sins against their own body. And as I look back, I realized, what I was doing, there's a way in which sexual sin, I believe, does a particular kind of damage to our souls that nothing else does in the same way. And so I had just stuffed all of these experiences and, one guy to the next. And I'd become really hard-hearted. Well, all of a sudden the dam burst in the car as I'm listening to this song, and I just began to weep. And I pulled over on the side of the interstate. I was probably 21 or 22 at the time. And my salvation prayer, right? I grew up in church. And so I knew the Romans road and I knew all the right words to put together, but there was never any surrender in it. I didn't want to go to hell. That was the motivation, but I didn't have any surrender. And finally, I was ready to surrender. And my salvation really wasn't this neat little prayer. It was, God, I've made a total disaster of my life. I don't even know if you want what's left of me, but if you do, you can have it. And that, boom. I mean, it was just the difference was night and day in terms of the Holy Spirit moving in. And I went from being a religious kid, or at least growing up in a religious home, to now having a relationship that I'd never had before. And so that shifted a lot of things. I was kind of at a honeymoon period with regard to the same-sex attraction after that for a while. And I was burning hot, honestly, for knowing God and being in the Word and having a desire for things that I'd never had a desire for before. And I always had to do, but I'd never really had much of a desire for. And but then after a number of, I'd say months or 6 months or so, a lot of the feelings started coming back because they'd never really been dealt with. And so so God's, really led me on this journey in some ways kind of through the wilderness, because not many churches, as I've said, are dealing with these issues. I couldn't just walk into the door of a church and say, hey, I'm wrestling with this and I'm struggling with this. What can I do, or how can I find help and hope? There really wasn't help and hope in most of the churches that I was involved with. And eventually the Lord brought me to this church in upstate New York, where I was on staff for 12 years. But I came to that church fresh out of adult bookstores and gay bars and living a completely sexually addicted life, hating what I was doing. And this was after salvation, hating what I was doing, but not knowing how to stop it. And I moved to this area where the church was, back to my hometown. And, the pastor of this church, I emailed him all that I was doing before I ever moved back, and told him that I wanted to move back, but wanted to know if there be some support for me. And, he said, Gary, if you want to move back here, we'll walk with you, which I think is astounding, because that many pastors would not do that. And many churches would not do that. So it was really and I'll wrap up with this, but this is an important point. It was at that church that I got into their lay counseling program, and I got into a small group right away. And it was several months after I started there and I moved back there that there was an announcement about a men's group coming back together again. And my immediate thought was, well, that's the last place on earth I ever want to be, is in a Christian men's group, because that's where all the shaming would happen, and I'll never measure up, and I'm not a man, and all these kinds of things going through my head, and in some ways being communicated by other guys in the past. And but the Lord wanted me there, and he made he was not quiet about that. And so I eventually went, and it took me a long time to open up and share about myself. I mean, I did a lot of talking because I knew a lot of Bible verses and I knew more than them about all this stuff. So I hid behind all that. And, but eventually I finally opened up and named homosexuality and pornography addiction and I don't know, some other things. And I was just so full of shame when I said that. And the leader got up out of his seat and came over and pulled me out of my seat and gave me this huge bear hug and just said, Gary, we are so glad that you're here and you belong with us. Now, I was in my early 30s at this time, and I'd never heard from the Christian community or any community of men besides the gay community. I'd never heard from any community of men that I belonged with them. And so it was really a powerful time. Half the guys in the room got up and behind him to hug me. And it was this powerful time of life-giving and transformation. And I shared my testimony with the church and was eventually hired on staff and in a business role to start with. And then that transitioned into overseeing the counseling ministry and eventually becoming the pastor of Soul Care Ministries. So anyway, that's been a long journey. But yeah, it was a hard journey. But you know what? I wouldn't trade my worst day today as a father, as a husband to my amazing wife, and as somebody who gets to speak into these issues and lead a ministry. I wouldn't trade my worst day today for my best day back then.
Wow. I said, dude, Gary, I mean, just hearing that, I literally, I start to tear up because I go, oh man, I've been in some churches that would not handle it the same way.
Right.
And I'm so thankful for those that do get that right and do handle it right like that. Okay, man, I'm writing things. I got so many questions. I know some of you have questions out there. I got so many questions. I'll start with one of mine since I'm hosting this, and then I'll go down. We've already got one question coming in. There's a lot of cancel culture. In other words, if you promote this, then you're done around any kind, it seems to me, any kind of trying to convert somebody who claims I have any kind of homosexuality, transgender, bisexual, any of the LGBTQ thing. There's a huge cancel culture idea concept that our culture has put on that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, and I would take it a step further. It's not even a cancel culture against those who are actively trying to convert. It's a cancel culture against those of us who would even share our stories and simply put it out there. I'm not running out and like proselytizing and going to now. There's some that do this and I think they do it very effectively. But whether it's gay pride marches or into gay bars. And I'm not. That's not where I've been called. And I think it'd be foolish for me to do that as well. But even for me to share my own story and to put it out there so that those who have a similar feeling that I had, where our attractions and our desires were unwanted, when same-sex attraction in this case is something that I don't want. Like I want something else for my life, but I don't know how in the world to ever get there. And what's happening is that not only is there a cancel culture, but there are even attempts, and ultimately, I think the ultimate goal is to make it illegal to even speak biblically about these issues, even in the most gracious and loving way possible, and let people know that that God is still in the business of transforming lives. And transformation does not look like, God, transformation doesn't look like I wanted it to, where God just pulls out, his divine wand and waves it. And one, I pray about this one evening and I wake up heterosexual the next day, or with heterosexual attractions, I should say. And that's what I wanted. And I was angry with God for not doing that. But for most of us and I know hundreds and hundreds of people by name and know their stories and their families that have come out of this, along with myself and my wife. And for most of us, it's a discipleship process, frankly, just like everybody else. And so I think that's an important thing to remember. But yeah, cancel culture is frightening in that it's sort of a shell game. This idea that we're protecting people from hate, or we're protecting people from something that is supposedly so bad, but yet if they want to pursue some help and support, ultimately what we're doing is we're shutting the door on their ability to find it. And I think that's a tragedy.
Okay, the other side of the coin, you got churches that, like I said, that would reject. You got those that would say, man, hey, what about those that just say, that's fine?
Right.
Well, what do you say to those that say, you alluded to it earlier, but what do you say to those that are like, no big deal. You can be gay. You can be a Christian. Fine. You're welcome to the family. Just stay just like you are.
Right.
That's the other side of the road, right? That's the pendulum the other way. What do you think about that?
So one of the reasons that we named our ministry Love and Truth Network is because we really feel like for churches to be relevant in our day and age around sexuality, it's not just LGBTQ. There's tons. The statistics are off the chart in terms of Christians, men, even women, and even leaders who are caught up in pornography addiction. I mean, you and I have had this conversation multiple times in the past. Other forms of sexual sin as leaders and as Christians, and so it's from a percentage basis, frankly, it's far less of the LGBTQ behavior that's affecting the church, as opposed to
True.
long-standing heterosexual brokenness within the church that's being hidden and swept under the carpet, largely. And
Yeah.
and so, but what's frustrating, or this idea of living in the tension of love and truth is like walking on a razor's edge, in our current culture. That if you shift to the left or the right very far, you're off either condemning and thumping and just focused all about truth, but truth that doesn't have any love in it, truth that doesn't have real compassion, truth that wants to just make pronouncements and judgments without rolling up your sleeves and getting into the mess of people's lives and walking with them. That really isn't very effective. On the other hand, if we're just affirming and blessing, things that the Bible clearly says are sin and not God's best for us, not God's design for us, then we're also not being very helpful. I mean, think about this. I finally surrendered my life to Jesus. And prior to that, in my early 20s, prior to that, I grew up in a Christian home. I'd been involved in homosexuality and all that, lived the life. And I could have had people, and I would have wanted this at one time. I could have had people, well-meaning Christians, affirming and blessing me and saying, God is totally fine with you being gay. He's made you this way. You can have your boyfriend. There's nothing wrong with that. You can have your relationship with this guy or whatever. God's totally fine with that. In the best of their intentions, they would have been patting my butt right into hell.
Wow.
Not because I'm gay. People don't go to heaven. People don't spend eternity with Jesus because they haven't surrendered their lives to him. But part of what Christians are unwittingly doing, who are trying to be affirming and kind and gracious and all of that, is we're blessing sinful behavior, patterns of sinful behavior, for people who aren't willing to, haven't come to a place of surrender and a death, right? I mean, we're called to deny ourselves by Jesus. If we're going to be his disciples, we need to deny ourselves and take up our crosses and follow after him. That is the pathway to life in Christ. And honestly, there is no other pathway. So trying to kind of patch together all these pieces of brokenness and then come to Jesus and say, well, this is who I am, and you're just going to need to accept me as I am, and I'm not going to change. That isn't surrendering to his lordship. Now, in saying that, I realize also that we come to Jesus in all kinds of brokenness. I'm not, and it may be a process, and that may be how people begin the journey. But what frustrates me is when you have Christians who, frankly, should know better, like they've read their Bibles, and they're actually coming along and affirming something. They're actually shutting the door on this deep relationship with Christ and on this call to deny ourselves. And they're actually doing far greater damage in the long run while they're trying to sort of appease in the short term, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah. So like the articles that are being written lately that maybe Jesus was gay, maybe he had a homosexual relationship with John and these things. I'll just let you comment on that, or with Peter, excuse me. I'll let you comment on that.
Well, and it would even it's the kind of stuff that's been said about David and Jonathan as well. And frankly, yes. I mean, I don't know how to say this any clearer. I hate that, because what that does, frankly, when it comes to like David and Jonathan and some of these closer relationships of Paul with Timothy and Jesus with John and others in the New Testament, other places of Scripture, that is really an ideal and something, frankly, that should be aspired to. I think definitely one of the things I've found as I've grown in my own masculinity, and as I've grown as a man who feels very comfortable, in my skin, even with all of my baggage and scars and all that stuff. What I've realized is that men, it doesn't matter whether they've been a part of the LGBT community or not. Men are lonely and hurting, and many of them are put on this veneer of anger and self-sufficiency and have kind of detached from their heart and their emotions. That's not healthy, honestly. And what you see with David and Jonathan and others in Scripture is this deep, incredible, intimate and affectionate relationship that doesn't cross boundaries. It's a union, it's a friendship, it's a brotherhood, not union. It's a friendship and a brotherhood that's blessed by God. But it doesn't cross those sexual boundaries. And so it frustrates me when my former community wants to take that and say, oh, see, they were bisexual, or they were this, or they were that. It really, first and foremost, I mean, it denigrates God's call and scripture. But on top of that, it really does damage to what God intends for us as women with women and bands of sisters, and men with men in bands of brothers, the way that he wants us to be deeply connected and supporting one another in the journey of life.
Wow, that's very well put. And you're right, it sure has thrown a lot of confusion
Mm-hmm.
into young people's lives. And I mean, even my own, how close can I get to a guy and it still be okay? And
Mm-hmm.
because man, I've got some guy friends that are really good guy friends, and
Yep.
I'm really thankful for that.
Yep.
And it's never been, weird for me. Okay, so somebody asked this question, and I think this goes into the kind of the way the church responds. So I'll let you respond to this. I feel like I can tell if someone's homosexual without them even telling me. How could this be possible if it's a lifestyle choice? Any thoughts on that? I was thinking as I read it at the beginning, I can tell if someone's homosexual. I know that in our society today, there are certain traits that you would
Sure.
kind of try to come to those conclusions, but I found myself wrong on those conclusions as
Right.
well. So
Right.
what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so first of all, there are several things in that question. Let me start with what the person kind of ends up with. If it's a lifestyle choice, I want to be really clear that we don't choose our feelings, right? I mean, we discover how we feel. Nobody wakes up one day thinking, at least, I mean, as LGBTQ becomes more and more popularized and is glamorized and lifted up as a great thing, then I think we're seeing shifts, and we're seeing more young people experimenting with in those areas, that kind of thing. But by and large, people are not waking up thinking, oh, I just want to be gay. It's that we discover over time, oh, I have these attractions, as I said about myself. And so that where the church is really one of the places where the church has made some foolish statements, or Christians have made some foolish statements, is this idea that homosexuality is a choice. And for those of us who've experienced it, immediately we were like, you guys are idiots. I mean, you don't know anything, because we know that we didn't choose our feelings. What is true, though, is that we do choose our behavior. So just because, and I know plenty of heterosexual guys who feel like, man, I don't want to be monogamous. I mean, I love women, and I want to be able to, have sex with multiple women and not sort of get settled into a relationship. And why is that not okay? And you see in the Old Testament that David had, however many wives, and Solomon, et cetera, and so many other places, and yet they were still blessed by God. So what's the big deal with that? You hear those kinds of arguments as well. And so it's not just, we can say, oh, somebody, I can sort of tell when someone's gay. First of all, let me just address that as well. I hear a lot of people talk about not labeling others. And then many of the people that talk about not labeling people are the very ones that turn around and label and feel like, oh, I know you. And that is, I mean, on the one hand, I get what that means. I think that we can, if we pay attention to people's affect and to their behavior and just the stuff that we put off, we could actually be more diligent about walking alongside of one another and stepping into another person's pain or sorrow or difficulty if we would pay attention to some of the cues that they're giving off, and rather than jumping into a conclusion and saying, oh, I know this about you. No, you don't, because there actually are guys who come across more effeminate, who come across as the stereotypical idea of what it means to be gay. They don't have any same-sex attraction whatsoever. They may just be more artistically inclined. They may love beauty, and they're not your typical rough and tumble kind of guy. And so when we take a look at those guys, or we look at a girl who's the sort of stereotypical tomboy, and she loves sports and this and various things, and we start pigeonholing, oh, well, she must be a lesbian. We have to be careful. It's one thing to say, I see some possibilities. I see some signs that some indicators that I'm wondering about. And if we have a relationship with that person and we're concerned for that person, I think on the basis of that relationship, we could go and just say, hey, I'm just wondering how things are really going in your life, and how things are going in a relationship with God. And I think we could even ask, depending again on the relationship and the age of the person and, a number of dynamics, we could even ask about what we might perceive to be true. But when we assume that we are absolutely right, that this is concrete based on my perception, I think we do a disservice to them. I think we do a disservice to ourselves and others as well.
Thank you for joining us for this engaging conversation. To view this and many more conversations in their entirety, we invite you to partner with us at creationtoday.org/partner.